Man, I remember that night so clearly. We were super excited, you know? The plan was to camp out in the backyard of my best friend's house. It was this huge old house, surrounded by a massive area of woods. The kind of place that gives you butterflies just looking at it, but we didn't really care. We just wanted to spend the night outside. No adults to hassle us. With a campfire, snacks, and scary stories. We set up the tents while there was still daylight, just to make sure everything was ready. The sky started to darken, and soon, night fell completely. The weather was perfect for camping, a light breeze, the sound of leaves rustling, and the smell of burning wood. But honestly, I never really liked those woods around the house. There was something off about them, a weird feeling, like we weren't really alone there. After eating and laughing a lot, we decided to play manhunt, which is basically hide and seek in the dark. It seemed like the best idea ever, especially since the yard was huge with plenty of good hiding spots. So we grabbed our flashlights and spread out. Everyone ran off in different directions, trying to be as sneaky as possible. At that moment, I had no idea what was about to happen. But let me tell you, if I had known, I never would have left my tent that night. So there I was, running through the yard, trying to find the best hiding spot. I was focused, you know? Listening for footsteps, the sound of dry leaves on the ground. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something different. There, at the edge of the woods, was a figure. Tall, skinny, and moving slowly. Like really slowly. I froze. You know that feeling when your heart stops for a second? It was exactly like that. I couldn't quite make out what I was seeing. My flashlight was kind of weak, but I could tell that it wasn't one of my friends. They were all running and laughing nearby. But this figure, it was just walking, straight into the trees, like it didn't care about anything around it. And there was something weird, man. The movements didn't seem normal. It was like every step was calculated, mechanical, you know? Almost like a puppet being controlled. I stood there, staring at it disappear into the woods. I tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize it, but couldn't. I was just left with that bad feeling, like a knot in my stomach. When the figure finally vanished among the trees, I didn't think twice. I ran back to the tent. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop looking back, thinking that thing might be coming after me. When I got inside the tent, my friends were still outside, playing like nothing had happened. I thought about telling them, but I don't know, I was afraid of sounding like an idiot, or worse, confirming that what I saw was real. So I stayed quiet. But at that moment, I already knew something was very wrong that night. I tried to calm down, but I couldn't. Even inside the tent with the zipper closed, I felt exposed. And to make things worse, every time I closed my eyes, that image of the figure came back in my head. Every detail. The strange way it walked, the fact that it didn't even look back. Like it knew I was there, but didn't care. My friends came back after a while, laughing and talking like nothing had happened. I forced a smile, tried to act normal, but something inside me had already changed. And that's when the noises started. At first, it was just a crack, like a branch snapping in the woods. I thought it was in my head, just the wind or some animal. But then, the footsteps started. And these footsteps, a man, they were closer than they should have been. It was like someone was walking right on the edge of the woods, almost on the line between the trees and the yard. I stopped breathing for a second, trying to listen better. And suddenly, I heard it again, heavy, slow footsteps, getting closer. The campfire outside was already dying out, so the only sound I could hear was those damn footsteps. I looked at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice anything, still talking about the game. And then came the breathing. Man, I swear it was like someone was right there, next to the tent, breathing heavily, like they just run a marathon. I was frozen. I knew it wasn't one of my friends. Couldn't be. My heart was pounding so fast I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. And then, out of nowhere, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent. A heavy, suffocating silence. I knew something or someone was out there, close, watching. But whatever it was, it didn't do anything right then. It just stayed there, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen. Maybe a few minutes, maybe hours. All I know is that the silence made me even more nervous. My whole body was tense, waiting for the next sound, any movement. But nothing happened, at least not for a while. Finally, my friends started to calm down too, and everyone settled into sleep. I tried to close my eyes, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, the footsteps, the breathing. Still, at some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion. But then I woke up, out of nowhere, in the middle of the night. Something was wrong. I could feel it. My heart started pounding again, and my ears were tuned in to any sound. That's when I realized there was someone inside the tent. In that moment, I froze. It was like the air had been sucked out of my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe right. I could only see a shadow crouched in the corner of the tent, almost right next to me. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. My eyes were locked on that thing, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. I couldn't see the face, couldn't make out any details. Just that dark silhouette, still, quiet, like it was waiting for something. In a moment of pure panic, I finally managed to let out a scream, and that was enough. I bolted out of the tent without thinking, tripping over things, and woke everyone up in the process. My friends woke up startled, not understanding what was going on, but I was already outside, staring at the tent, waiting for that thing to come out. But nothing happened. The tent just sat there the same way we left it before going to sleep. My friends started coming out too, confused and nervous because of my scream. I was shaking, trying to explain what I had seen, but they just looked at me, not really believing it. Then we heard a noise, the sound of branches snapping. We all turned in the direction of the sound, coming from near the woods, and once again, that heavy silence took over. Only this time, I wasn't the only one scared. Everyone was tense, waiting for something to appear. And, of course, it didn't take long for the parents to come running out of the house, asking what had happened. I tried to explain, but the words came out all jumbled. I don't know if they believed me, but after hearing enough, they decided to call the police. When the cops arrived, they searched the yard and the surrounding area. They didn't find anything, at least, nothing that explained the presence inside the tent. But I know what I saw, and at that moment, I also knew that whatever it was, it hadn't gone away. After that night, nothing was the same. I went back home, but that feeling of being watched, it never left me. All the time, I felt like someone or something was keeping an eye on me. The police never found anything concrete, just some footprints in the yard near the tent. Footprints that, of course, no one could explain.
He started having nightmares.
Always the same thing. I was in the yard, alone, and that tall figure with its strange movements was coming out of the woods, getting closer and closer to me. When it finally reached me, I'd wake up, drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing. Sometimes, I'd wake up thinking someone was in my room, just like in the tent. I'd jump out of bed, look around, but nothing, always nothing. My friends seemed to get over it all pretty quickly. To them, it was just a night of scares that got out of hand. They laughed, said I'd overreacted, that maybe it was just a homeless person or some animal. But I knew it wasn't that simple. That fear didn't go away. Days passed, but the paranoia remained. I avoided going out at night, always feeling like that thing could be nearby, watching. Shadows made me nervous. Sudden noises made me jump. I knew something was wrong with me, but how could I explain that to someone without sounding crazy? So I kept it to myself. To this day, I can't go camping. Every time someone suggests it, I make up some excuse. I don't even want to think about sleeping outdoors again, especially near trees. And whenever I'm alone at night, that image comes back into my head, the tall figure, moving slowly without a rush, like it knows that no matter how hard I try to run, it will always be there, waiting for me in the darkness. It was a winter night, the kind where the icy wind feels like it's cutting through your skin. The friends were gathered at Sarah's house, which was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a seemingly endless forest. The house was old but cozy, with wooden walls and a fireplace that tried to fend off the cold. Inside, the warmth of the girls' laughter made the place feel less eerie than it really was. The sleepover was something they had been planning for weeks. Sarah, Emily, Jess, and Abby were excited, looking forward to a night of scary stories, popcorn, and maybe even a few silly games that only teenagers find funny. They were enjoying the freedom of being away from their parents, feeling brave about spending a night in the forest. Sarah, always the bold one, suggested they take a walk along the trail that started just behind the house. "It's just a quick walk," she said, trying to convince the others. "It'll be fun. We'll be back before it gets too dark." The others hesitated, but of course, no one wanted to seem scared. Emily, the shyest of the group, bit her lip but eventually gave in to her friends' excited looks. "Okay, but just a quick walk, all right?" Flashlights in hand, coats pulled tightly around them, they set off. The sound of the house door closing behind them felt like it sealed the fate of the night. The air was damp and heavy, and the silence of the forest was only broken by the nervous giggles of the girls. "Imagine if we see a wolf," Jess joked, trying to lighten the tension that was already building in the group. But the truth was, even though they tried to hide it, they all felt that nervous flutter in their stomachs. They were in an unfamiliar place, far from any help, and the night seemed to be growing darker, heavier. With every step down the trail, the initial excitement began to give way to a feeling of unease. Little did they know, that seemingly innocent walk would be just the beginning of a night they would never forget. The narrow trail seemed to close in around them, with tall trees casting strange shadows under the light of their flashlights. Every step echoed in the oppressive silence of the forest, and the jokes started to fade. The girls stayed close together, with their lights flickering ahead, illuminating just enough to avoid tripping over roots or branches. That's when Jess, who was a little ahead, suddenly stopped. "Guys, do you see that?" Her flashlight wavered in her hand, pointing forward. The others gathered around her, trying to see what had caught her attention. And there he was, standing in the middle of the trail, a man. He wasn't a lumberjack, nor did he look like someone who belonged there. He was dressed completely inappropriately for the cold night. A thin shirt, torn pants, and nothing but worn-out shoes on his feet. But what really disturbed them was the smell. A strong, rotten odor that the wind carried toward them, making them all instinctively wrinkle their noses. The man had his back to them at first, but when he sensed their presence, he slowly turned his face toward them. His expression was blank, his eyes lifeless, almost as if he was just observing, but not really seeing. No one said a word. They all stood still, the sound of their own breathing now deafening. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice low and steady. "Let's keep walking slowly. Don't look at him." They started moving, skirting around the strange figure, keeping their heads down. But the discomfort only grew. That awful smell seemed to get stronger, clinging to the air around them. They quickened their pace, wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. And then they heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps right behind them. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The girls' hearts started pounding harder, almost as loud as the sound of their own hurried feet on the trail. None of them dared to look back. It was as if doing so would confirm the very real danger they felt creeping up on them. Emily, already struggling to control her panic, nervously whispered, He's following us." The others just nodded, quickening their pace even more. The sound of dry leaves crunching under the man's feet made it impossible to deny what was happening. Suddenly, Sarah couldn't take it anymore and turned around for a second, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The man was even closer now, and in his hand, something gleamed in the moonlight. A blade, rusty and jagged, but definitely a weapon. "Run!" Sarah shouted, and that was the trigger. The girls started sprinting down the trail, each trying not to trip on the uneven ground, driven by pure survival instinct. The sound of the man's footsteps picked up pace too, as if he had decided it was time to strike. They couldn't think anymore, they could only run. Emily stumbled over a root and nearly fell, but Abby grabbed her, pulling her back up without stopping. The terror burned in their legs, but the adrenaline kept them going. The sound of the man's heavy breathing was getting closer, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to catch them. But miraculously, Sarah's house came into view between the trees. They sprinted toward safety, fear coursing through every fiber of their being. They reached the porch, gasping for breath, and Sarah managed to unlock the door with trembling hands. Once they were all inside, she slammed the door shut and turned the lock. They collapsed on the living room floor, trying to catch their breath and make sense of what had just happened. For a few seconds, the only sound was their labored breathing. Was the man gone? What did he want? None of them knew, but they all felt the same thing. This wasn't over yet. They sat there on the living room floor, trying to catch their breath and process what had just happened. Sarah kept her eyes on the door, as if expecting the man to appear any second and start pounding on it. But the silence outside was almost as terrifying as the sound of those heavy footsteps they had heard just minutes earlier. Abby was the first to stand up, trying to be rational. "We should call the police, right? Tell them what happened." She grabbed her phone but quickly realized that, in such a remote area, the signal was almost non-existent. None of them could get a stable connection. They were cut off. "Let's lock all the doors and windows," Jess suggested, trying to keep her composure. The girls got up, still trembling, and began checking every entrance in the house. They locked windows, closed curtains, and made sure no one could get in. But even so, the fear lingered. The feeling that they were being watched wouldn't go away. Back in the living room, they tried to regain control of the situation. They turned on the TV to drown out the eerie silence, hoping to distract themselves with anything that could make it seem like this was just an ordinary night. But it wasn't. Nothing about that night felt normal. Sarah sat on the couch, pulling her legs close to her body. He was just standing there, like he knew we were going to show up, like he was waiting. Emily, who hadn't said much since they came inside, finally found her voice. "And the smell. I've never smelled anything so awful. Like he wasn't alive." That observation made the atmosphere even more tense. They tried not to think about it, but the truth was that the fear was still with them, like a shadow that wouldn't leave them alone. Then, a soft noise came from outside. They exchanged glances, frozen, trying to identify what it could be. The sound returned, something dragging near the living room window. Sarah, her heart racing, got up slowly and walked toward the window, trying to peek without being seen. She pulled the curtain back a little, and what she saw made her blood run cold again. The man was back. He was standing outside, in the darkness, staring directly at the house. This time, he wasn't alone. Next to him, something, hard to make out in the dim light, seemed to be moving, something crawling on the ground. Sarah was paralyzed, her eyes locked on that shadowy figure outside. The man was there, motionless, with the same empty expression as before. But now there was something else. Something slowly moving beside him. Something she couldn't quite identify at first. It was like a shadow crawling along the ground. An undefined form that seemed to pulse and writhe in a way that wasn't natural. "He's back," Sarah whispered, her eyes still fixed on the window. The fear in her voice made the other girls move closer, trying to understand what was happening. Jess pulled the curtain back to take a look, and when she saw the man and that thing next to him, she stepped back, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream. What is that?" Abby asked, her voice barely a whisper, feeling the terror creeping back in. No one had an answer. That thing, whatever it was, seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, like it was part of the terror the man brought with him. The man took a step toward the house, and the shadow next to him slithered forward, making a wet, nauseating sound. The girls backed away, panic rising again. They knew that locking the doors and windows wouldn't be enough to keep out something so strange and unknown. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear. "Through the back door, we can run to the car and drive away." But as she spoke, the sound of something knocking on the front door interrupted her plan. It was a slow, methodical knock, as if the man was testing the strength of the door. Desperation took over. They ran toward the kitchen where the back door was, but as soon as they reached it, they heard the same knocking sound, only now coming from the back door. It was as if the man, or perhaps that thing, knew what they were planning. They were surrounded. Sarah looked at her friends, all with the same terror in their eyes. "We have to hide. Let's go to the basement. Quick!" With no other option, they ran for the basement, descending the creaky wooden stairs as fast as they could. Downstairs, the cold was even more intense, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. They locked the door behind them and huddled in a corner, trying not to make any noise, trying to control their breathing. From upstairs, they heard slow, heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking through the house, searching for them. The sound grew louder, closer, until suddenly, it stopped. A deadly silence filled the basement. The girls stayed completely still, their hearts pounding uncontrollably, waiting for the next move. Then, from somewhere in the shadows, a soft, dragging sound, like something moving across the floor, filled the room. The sound was coming from inside the basement. You know those situations that seem harmless at first glance? Well, that's exactly how it all started. It was just an ordinary Tuesday at work, and Sebastian, a guy I saw every day, invited me to lunch. Nothing out of the ordinary, after all, he'd always been a friendly guy. During lunch, he mentioned he had an apartment in Florida and was thinking about spending the weekend there. Then came the invitation. "Why don't you come with me? It'll be fun. We can relax, enjoy the beach." I have to admit, at the time, the idea sounded great. I needed some time away from everything. And Sebastian, well, he'd always been easygoing at work, one of those people everyone liked having around. He never showed any signs of being a problematic person. It just seemed like a good opportunity to unwind, so why not accept, right? But I didn't want to go alone. I asked my brother to come along. We've always gotten along well, and I thought it would be nice to have someone close with me, just to make sure everything went smoothly. My brother agreed immediately. Beach, sun, cold beers. It sounded perfect. And that's how it all began, with a casual invitation and the promise of relaxing days. If I had known what was coming, well, maybe I would have declined right away. We arrived at Sebastian's apartment in Florida in the early afternoon. The sun was shining brightly, and the atmosphere was exactly what I'd expected from a place like that. Warm, pleasant, perfect for leaving all worries behind. Sebastian greeted us at the door with that same friendly smile he always had, holding a beer in each hand, already ready to kick off what he called a mini vacation. The apartment was small but cozy. It had an old-school vibe with simple furniture, but what really mattered was the location. You could hear the sound of the waves crashing on the beach just across the street. It was the ideal setting for what should have been a peaceful weekend. That afternoon was chill. We laughed, drank, and the conversation flowed easily, just like it always did at work. Nothing out of the ordinary. Sebastian seemed like the same guy I'd known for years. My brother was relaxed too, and I started thinking I'd finally made a good choice by accepting the invitation. But then, as the sun began to set, something changed. It wasn't anything I could immediately pinpoint, but the atmosphere started to feel strange. Sebastian, who had been lively earlier, grew quieter, almost as if he were lost in some dark thought. I tried to brush it off. I figured maybe he was just tired from the trip, but that uneasy feeling was there, lingering in the air. As the night went on, that sense that something was off only grew stronger. Sebastian, who had been so full of energy at the start, seemed to be slipping into some dark place inside his own mind. You know when you're talking to someone, but you can tell they're not really there? That's exactly what it was like. He started taking long pauses between his words, as if he was carefully choosing what to say. And when he spoke, his voice had a different tone. Quieter, almost monotone. The easy smile he used to flash so effortlessly had vanished completely. Instead, he just stared at us, his eyes glazed over, like he was studying each of us. My brother and I exchanged glances several times, trying to figure out what was going on. The laid-back conversations we had planned turned into uncomfortable silences, with only the sound of the TV in the background to fill the void. I tried to break the ice, suggesting we watch a movie or play something to lighten the mood, but Sebastian seemed oblivious to any attempt. Every suggestion I made was met with a simple no or a shake of his head. He started pacing around the living room, back and forth, like he was trying to shake off some thought he couldn't escape. Something was definitely wrong. And, the worst part was that feeling in my gut, that intuition you just can't ignore. Something told me the night was only going to get worse. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling. It wasn't a noise that woke me or anything obvious. It was a pressure on my neck. When I opened my eyes, my heart nearly stopped. It was Sebastian, leaning over me, his hands tightly gripping my throat, his face just inches from mine. His eyes were wide, but what scared me the most was the expression on his face. It wasn't anger, it was something worse, a kind of emptiness, like he wasn't really there. Panicked, my hands instinctively went to my neck, trying to pry off those hands that seemed to tighten with every passing second. I tried to scream, but I could barely get any air through my throat. My vision started to blur, and all I could think was, this can't be happening. With one last burst of strength, I managed to kick him in the legs. Sebastian lost his balance for a second, just enough for his grip to loosen. I seized the moment and shoved him with all the strength I had left. He fell back, and I jumped to my feet, gasping for air as adrenaline surged through my body. My brother, who had been sleeping in the other room, woke up from the commotion and came running. He saw Sebastian on the floor, completely confused, but I didn't need to explain. I grabbed the first thing I saw, my keys, and yelled at my brother to grab our stuff. There was no time for questions. We needed to get out of there. Sebastian just sat there, watching us as we frantically packed up our things. He didn't say a word, just stared at us with that same empty look, as if what had just happened was normal. We left the apartment without looking back. We ran to the car like our lives depended on it. And in that moment, I truly believed they did. The night air was heavy, stifling, but all I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between us and Sebastian. We got in the car, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys to start the engine. My brother was in shock too, the adrenaline written all over his face. Neither of us said a word. There was nothing to say. The silence in the car was broken only by the sound of our heavy breathing and the thud of our bags thrown into the back seat. I started the car and sped away from there, not caring where we were headed. I just wanted to get out. We drove for a few minutes, maybe more, until I finally felt like we were far enough away. I pulled over at some random gas station, and we just sat there for a moment trying to process what had just happened. My brother finally broke the silence, asking what the hell had happened, but the truth was, I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. What I did know was that this trip, which was supposed to be a break, had turned into a nightmare that I was lucky to escape from alive. And Sebastian, I never had contact with him again. I don't know what happened to him after that night, and honestly, I'd rather not know. One thing's for sure, I'm never accepting another vacation invite from someone without really knowing who they are. Some things just aren't worth the risk.